Yes, sir. You are now live.
You are the man. I wasn't sure you would.
Why would you know me too well?
All right, it's time to get started. Good to see everybody this morning. If you're visiting, we're glad that you're here. Hope you'll always feel welcome here at Dalraida. We have 2 more weeks of this class. Next week is Thanksgiving week, and so we won't have class. And then December 1st and December 8th will be the last 2 weeks of this class. So I hope to see you then. We are talking about questions, and in case you haven't been here this semester, we're talking about questions that God asked in the Bible, not searching for information, but trying to get the people he was asking to think, and trying to get the people that he was asking to examine themselves. And so that's kind of why we're calling this series God's Couch, because it's an opportunity not only for the people who were asked these questions in the Bible, but for us to consider and to reflect and to think, what can we learn from the question that's being asked. And for the last few weeks, we have been in the Gospels talking about questions that Jesus, who was God, also questions that he asked people. So we're in Mark chapter 9 this morning, if you have your Bibles. And before we start looking at our question, looking at the context of the question and all of those things, I want you to consider the question on the board. And not just the quote-unquote right answer to this, but I want you to consider the answer in your life. For those of you who claim to follow Jesus, who claim to be Christians, why? What is the purpose of that in your life? And I'm asking for a serious reflection here, because it might not be that the true answer is the answer you're most proud of. It might be that the immediate answer and the honest answer in your life could be something that you realize maybe that shouldn't be the first thing I think of. Maybe that shouldn't be the purpose of Christianity in my life. Because would you guys agree that there are some ways of looking at Christianity and its purpose that can be very selfish and self-centered and self-serving? Would you agree with that? Has that ever been the case in the Bible, that people viewed their relationship with God or their relationship with Jesus in a self-centered way? It certainly has been the case. So What is the purpose of Christianity? We all know the quote-unquote right answers, but why are you here? And, what does this mean to you? And what are you hoping to get out of this? Those are really important questions to consider, because if we have the wrong answer to that, then odds are we could be living our life in the wrong way and in the wrong direction. And we're going to see some of that in our story this morning and in the question that Jesus asks. And this is the question we're going to consider. What were you discussing on the way? Is the question that we're going to consider. And as usual, we're going to build up to this. We're going to get some context, and we're going to really try to figure out, why did he ask this question? What did it mean to the disciples when he asked it, and what can we learn from it? So we're going to begin with what I'm going to call selective hearing. That's kind of the name of this little section. And I have verses 1 through 32 of chapter 9 on the board for us to consider. But I'm realizing that the real context backs up a little further than that. And so I want you to back up to chapter 8, beginning around verse 31. And if someone would read Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38, and let's talk about that for a moment.
And he began to teach them that the Son of Man may suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels.
Okay. So, Jake, in your own words here, what are some of the things that are happening in this passage that, from the point of view of the disciples, and especially Peter, obviously, what are they hearing and seeing and experiencing in this section? What's going on with them in this section?
I would say, they don't know who Jesus truly is.
Okay.
And it's kind of like throughout his ministry so far, they look at him as like their hero, and now they're hearing talks about their hero who's going to have to go through a lot of suffering, and they're like, I don't think that's going to happen. Like, no way. So it's kind of hard for their minds to wrap around it.
Okay. Go back to verse number 33. Is it just that the disciples are thinking, surely this isn't going to happen. Jesus is not going to die. Is that what they're thinking, or is it stronger than that? Was their reaction stronger than that?
They're also setting their mind on things of man because they want
Okay,
him to
we're
be
going to certainly see that. But what did Peter do to Jesus when
Rebuked
Jesus
him.
told him plainly that he was going to die?
Rebuked him.
Rebuked him. Isn't that interesting? Who's the master here? Who's the teacher? Who's always right and never wrong? Well, it's Jesus, but Peter thinks you've said something wrong and you need to be corrected and rebuked. And that's very interesting. And so what Peter hears, and he's probably speaking on behalf of all of these disciples when he does this, what Peter hears is something that just does not fit with who he thinks Jesus is. And so he feels the need to rebuke Jesus. And Jesus responds in language that is about as harsh as you could use for a person, isn't it? What does he call Peter?
Satan.
Get behind me, Satan. Now, I don't think this is Jesus saying, Peter, you are Satan. But what he's saying is, Peter, Satan is using you right now to say and do something that is contrary to what I came to do. And so I see what you're saying from its real source. This is coming from Satan. and you need to stop thinking and saying these things. And then he calls the crowd to him, and he talks to them about what it's going to look like to follow him. You're going to have to take up your cross. You're going to have to lose your life. It's all about sacrifice. And it's all about understanding the value of a soul. And then in that last verse he says, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power. So there's lots of things that Jesus is saying here. Almost all of them have to do with stuff the disciples don't seem to understand, right? They don't seem to get it. Look at chapter 9 beginning in verse 1. In verse 2. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, This is my beloved Son, listen to him. And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. And they asked him, Why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? And he said to them, Elijah does come first to restore all things. And how is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written of him. So Jesus says, I want to take you 3 up onto a mountain. I want you to experience something. I want you to see and hear some things. And so Peter, James, and John, after this exchange, 6 days after this exchange that we just read about, they have this incredible experience on this mountain. And they see Jesus transfigured. They see Moses and Elijah sort of minimized, which, by the way, that would have been a very weird thing for Peter, James, and John, because Moses and Elijah are, about as big as you can get in the Jewish community of this day. I mean, they're heroes, they're superstars. And Jesus, is with them. He's alive. He's their age. He's a physical being. And sometimes we tend to take for granted the people who are right here in front of us, right? The people that we have in our lives, the people that still are alive and exist. And, they couldn't be nearly as great as the ones who are dead and gone, right? And so they have a problem in some ways with seeing Moses and Elijah as being greater, perhaps, than the one that they currently serve. And God makes this very clear that that's not the case. And Jesus continues to tell them things. He tells them on the way down the mountain about the resurrection. And don't tell people about this until after the resurrection. And they ask questions about that like they don't understand that. He told them plainly about that in the last chapter 6 days ago, didn't he? He told them plainly, clearly. He mentions it again. They don't get it. Okay? So what we have here with Peter, James, and John, we have these very plain teachings. We have these powerful experiences. We have reteaching and reinforcing by Jesus, and they're still not hearing him. They're still not getting it. And so with Peter, James, and John, the things that they're seeing, the things that they're hearing, the things that they're experiencing, they have selective hearing. They're only hearing parts of what Jesus is saying. They're only seeing parts of what Jesus is showing them. And the parts that they're seeing and hearing are the parts that seem to probably fit into what they already believe. For example, go back to chapter 9, verse 1. Do you think chapter 9, verse 1 was something that stuck out to them, that maybe they held on to, that does fit what they're expecting? Jesus talks here about the kingdom, and he talks about the kingdom coming with power. Well, that's what we believe, Jesus. That's what we think is going to happen. Now you're talking. The kingdom is coming with power. That's how we want to hear you talk. Not all this death and burial and resurrection and carrying your cross stuff, I mean, you must be confused when you say stuff like that. We're talking about a kingdom that's coming with power. You know, that's what we see. You know, and they don't even really seem to have a problem with him being glorified and transfigured before them. They're okay with that too. But the dying part, they just don't necessarily accept. So they're hearing and they're seeing and experiencing a whole range of things, but they're only listening to part of it. They're only listening to part of it. Now, when you get to the next section, the other 9 are at the foot of the mountain. And without reading this entire text, does anybody remember what's happening at the foot of the mountain with the other 9 when Jesus comes down with Peter, James, and John? What's going on? Skim through there and tell me in your own words what's happening here at the foot of the mountain with the other 9 disciples.
They're trying to cast out a demon out of the boy.
Okay, they've got a hard case, if you will. They've got somebody that's come to them with somebody who's in need of healing. They got this demon-possessed boy. The father has brought him so that this demon could be cast out of his son. And what has happened with these 9 disciples who previously have been able to do this? What's going on? When Jesus comes down, what does he see?
They're arguing.
It's a chaos. And you can picture all of these people, this dad, his demon-possessed son, these 9 disciples, and this crowd has gathered now because this is a scene now. And they can't cast out this demon. The 9 of them collectively, none of them individually can cast out this demon. And Jesus comes down and says, what are you arguing about with them? And it gets explained to him. And Jesus is a little frustrated with this faithless generation, verse 19. And he's probably not just talking about these people. He's probably including his disciples. And so what does he do? He asks this father a few questions, and Jesus says, well, I'll take care of this. And he does. And he casts this demon out. He commands him to come out of this boy. And it happens. And Jesus' disciples are like, why couldn't we do that? And what is his answer in verse number 29?
Can't be driven out by anything but prayer.
Okay, that seems quite obvious, doesn't it? Prayer is just relying on God and asking God to do something that perhaps you are not capable of doing. Where did their power to cast out demons come from in the first place? Did it ever come from them? It's never been something that they could do on their own. God gave them the authority to do it. He gave them the ability to do it, but it was never something that they could do. So what has happened here? As these 9 disciples, without Jesus, Peter, James, and John, what has happened to them as they try to cast out this demon? How are they trying to do it?
By themselves.
By themselves. Did that work? No. And it's not like Jesus says, listen, you forgot the magic words. You forgot the secret formula. You forgot the recipe. I know it's complicated. Let's get the book out and go over it. No, he just says, you just can't do this without me. And that's kind of a big duh moment. But you can almost, in thinking about this, you can almost picture these 9 disciples, and we don't have this recorded. You can almost picture them taking turns. Let me try. Let me have a try out. You guys stand back. I knew you couldn't do it. I believe I am the greater demon caster outer than you. Just stand back and watch me. And they crack their knuckles a little bit, and they each take a turn at it, and everybody fails, and maybe 3 or 4 of them say, let's try it together. And they try all kinds of maybe combinations, and the crowd keeps growing because they just keep failing time after time after time. And what's going on here is that these disciples are focused on something that they shouldn't be focused on. And they're not focused on the one thing that can actually give them the power to do what they're being asked to do. It's very simple, but it's very important. And so the parts that they are seeing and hearing and experiencing are very diverse. And Jesus has shown and told them everything they need to hear, everything they need to see, everything they need to know. But what are they paying attention to? Which parts? Peter, James, John, and all the other 9 disciples, what are they paying attention to?
Themselves.
They're focused on themselves. And we're about to prove that. The rest of this lesson is going to absolutely prove that. That's not a speculative answer, by the way. That's absolutely right. They're focused on themselves and what they can do and what can be done for them. And so they're failing over and over and over just in this one section of Scripture. And so it's because they're not hearing Jesus and they're not seeing everything that He's showing them. And this is a problem. And then we get to what I would call part 2, which is the fact that this is a sustained habit. Is this a one-time thing for the disciples? Is this well, they had this problem in Mark chapter 8 and 9, but we fixed it and we moved on and everything's fine now? No, this is the problem. And this comes up over and over again in the Gospels. If you have your Bible, somebody read Luke 22:24, and somebody else go to Matthew 20 and get ready to read verses 20 and 21. This is 2 separate occasions from the one we're looking at today. 2 very different, completely different occasions. Does somebody read Luke 22:24?
A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest.
Okay, so in Luke 22:24, they're fighting about who's going to be the greatest. Okay, based on that, have they heard anything that Jesus has tried to tell them in the section we're looking at? Because Jesus has made it clear, you want to be the greatest, you have to take up a cross. This is not about you. This is not about you being magnified and glorified and illuminated. So this is a problem for them. Look at Matthew 20, verses 20 and 21. Somebody read that.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard.
That's the wrong verse. I probably gave you the wrong verse.
Matthew 20 is, then the mother of the sons of
Yeah,
Zebedee
that's it.
came to Jesus with her sons, bowing down and making a request of him. And he said to her, "What do you wish?" She said to him, "Command that in your kingdom these 2 sons of mine may sit, one on your right hand and one on your left."
Okay, this is one of my favorite passages. James and John, grown men, following Jesus around for a while now, and they've had this argument with the other disciples so many times that they're like, "Hey, Mom, can you help us out with this? Could you come and tell Jesus that we'd really like to be on the right and the left of Him when the kingdom comes? Maybe he'd listen to you. You're a respectable person. You're older than we are, and you're older than he is." Maybe and I don't know if that's what they were thinking, but that's what happened. They get Mom involved. Could we be greatest? And so this is a recurring habit. This is a mindset that when Jesus talks about the kingdom, they hear X, and Jesus actually means Y. Okay, this is their problem. And so we might say, why is this happening? Why does this keep coming up? Why are they stuck in this mindset? And I would just give you a few reasons here. The first one is that they have sacrificed a lot to follow Jesus. That much is true. You know, they left their nets, they left their jobs, they left their families, they left everything to follow Jesus, and you see that in Matthew 19:27. So when they said yes to Jesus, they said no to a lot of other things, and they're kind of wondering, what are we going to get out of this? So that's a normal human reaction. But number 2, they've completely misunderstood the kingdom, and y'all have talked about this in this class. And it's the prevailing problem with these guys. They've misunderstood the kingdom, along with probably every other Jew who's alive at this point. They think it's physical, and it's not. Also, they've chosen their focus. They've chosen their focus. And it's because they've misunderstood the kingdom. What they thought they were signing up for is not what it turns out they're going to be part of. And so there's this sustained habit, this mindset that's prevailing in the disciples that is not hearing what Jesus is saying, at least not all of it, and they're reading into what he's saying things that are not true. And therefore, they continue to have arguments. in disputes among themselves about who's going to be the greatest, and you could just hear Jesus breathing heavy every time it happens. Because it's not like he's been talking to them in riddles. It's not like he's been saying, now listen, I can't really tell you what's going to happen in just a little while with me, with this cross and this resurrection. I can't really tell you about it, so I'm going to speak in riddles. Not at all. He's told them plainly, and they will not hear it. And so we have these first two sections that we're understanding, and now we move to what I would call selfishness hunting in verse 33. And this is where Jesus asked the question. They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" And so here's our question for the day, and I want you to think about this question. So they're traveling, they're walking together. Jesus is probably in front, they're following behind, they're having a discussion amongst themselves. And when they get to where they're going, Capernaum, they get into the house, they all sit down, maybe they're having a meal or something. Jesus asks this question. Why does Jesus ask this question at this point? Why wait until they're in the house? Why not just stop them on the way and say, hey, I hear what you guys are talking about back there. What's the point of waiting till we're sitting down in the house and asking them now? By the way, I don't know the answer. I'm just asking you to think.
Maybe we catch them off guard.
Okay? Let them have their conversation. Let them settle it. Now, this is the part I don't think we think about much. As they're having these recurring conversations about who's the greatest, do you think anybody's in the lead? They all think it ought to be them, I guess. And maybe they take a little vote every time. Well, Peter's leading by 3 points today. You know, let's look at the chart. We got the red and the blue wave going here. I don't know how they're doing it, but this is not just an argument that goes nowhere. I'm sure they got names. And one of the names I think is probably towards the top of the list is the one that probably shouldn't even be on the list, right? Who's probably towards the top of the list? Who sits right next to Jesus during the Last Supper? Who keeps the money? I think Judas is probably jockeying a little bit for position because he really thinks, along with the rest of them, this is going to be a physical kingdom. He's already making money off of this thing. And when it really lands and when they really start making money, he's going to be set for life. Why can't it be me? Maybe that's what's going on. But they've got answers to this. They've got theories. They've probably got a running tally of who's winning in the greatest in the kingdom of heaven conversation. So they're all sitting down. They think they got to have their conversation without Jesus hearing them again. And he says, "Hey, what were y'all talking about?" And what do they say? I love this. This is just like a bunch of kids, isn't it? What do they say?
It's silent.
They don't say nothing. And you can almost see the lump in their throat, and they're sitting around and they're like, he hurt us. Rats. I'm not going to say anything. Peter got chewed out last time. He tried to tell Jesus to stop that. Mark?
I just think it's funny that they would even talk like this because they've been around him when he's read people's minds.
Yes.
So even thinking something, he knows it.
Yeah. Selective hearing.
Yeah.
To the highest degree, these disciples are behaving in ways that make no sense. They're living with Jesus. They're walking with Jesus. They're seeing everything he can do and everything he does, and they don't act like it. They still think it's okay to have these conversations about who's the greatest in the kingdom when Jesus has plainly said, you're missing the point. So they don't say anything. Now, what does silence usually communicate when you're asked a pointed question? Because I can think of some times when I come into a situation, whether it's a youth group or a college group or a bunch of my children, and say, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" And you know what I get? Nothing. Because everybody in the room knows, well, we don't really want to say. We don't really want to tell you what we were doing. And I hope you're really asking because you don't know. Because if you do know, we're in trouble. That's what's happening here, isn't it? This is basic human nature. This is basic human behavior. They're silent because they don't want to tell him. But he already knows, and they should know that. Are they learning anything? Do you think that they learn anything in this passage? We know that they don't. Because we just read 2 other passages that happen later in the Gospels where they're having the exact same conversation. Hey, what were you talking about on the way? Don't worry about it, Jesus. You just lead the kingdom. We'll figure everything else out. So they're really living in an alternate reality, if you will. And they're being incredibly selfish. And Jesus is asking them to see that. And Jesus is just like a good parent. Sometimes a good parent doesn't just bust into a room and say, I see the bad thing that you're doing. A good parent might say, well, let me let you think about this. Do you see what you're doing? Because until you do, all the discipline and all of the plain teaching and all the experiences in the world are not going to change your behavior. Until you get it. And they do not. So Jesus says, I want you to hunt in your own hearts for selfishness and see what you can find. But notice what happens next in part 4. I would call this symbolic and systematic humbling. Look at verses 35 through 37 and somebody read those.
And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all, and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me.
Okay, so this is how Jesus handled this. We're going to talk about this and break it down in just a minute. But let's go back to the other 2 examples that we just read and see what he did there. Somebody go to Luke 22, go back to Luke 22, and read verses, let's see. Let me find where I am here. Luke 22, read verse 25 through 27. This is right after they're disputing about who's going to be the greatest. Somebody read those.
And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is the greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table, or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves.
Okay, now go over to Matthew 20, and let's just complete the trifecta here. Matthew 20. Let's see how he handles it this time. Matthew 20, look at verse number 22. This is James and John and their mother coming to ask if they can be the greatest. And what does Jesus say? Let's read verse 22. Jesus answered, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink? They said to him, we are able. He said to them, you will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those to whom it has been prepared by my Father. And when the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the 2 brothers. But Jesus called them to him and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and that their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. These are separate occasions. Every time that these disciples have this discussion, Jesus says what? In so many words, does Jesus ever let this slide? No, we don't need to talk about this right now. Come here. We're going to need to talk about this right now. And the second, third, fourth, fifth time that he had this conversation, what do you think he's thinking?
You still don't get it.
Did I pick the wrong people? Are you this dense? Do you remember the last time that you had this argument and I called you together and told you this thing? You're not listening. I don't know about you. I'd be frustrated with these guys by this point. They're just simply stuck. And so Jesus, in our passage, go back to Mark chapter 9, this is what he does. He sat down, he called the 12, and he said to them. So again, he's like, okay, if you don't want to talk about why you were discussing what you were discussing on the way, you want to be silent, all right, I'm not going to be silent. I've got something to say about it if you don't. And so he calls them to himself. Notice he's not chewing them out or yelling at them, but he says, we're going to talk about this again. And he says, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Simple, plain, clear. We just read a couple other places where he says the same thing. And here Jesus says, let me try something else. And he finds a child. There must be a child living in this house in Capernaum. He says, come here, kid. And he brings this kid. I don't know how old he or she was. And he puts him in the middle, and the kid's probably like, what is happening right now? I don't know what I did wrong, but there's a lot of men looking at me. And Jesus says, what does he say about this child? Go back to Mark 9, and somebody tell me. What's Jesus say when he pulls this child?
Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me.
Okay? So Jesus in different places in the Gospels uses children to illustrate different things. And so he's adding a piece of the puzzle here with this child, and he's challenging them to look past what they perceive as greatness. You're all jockeying for position. You're all debating about who's the greatest, who's going to be the greatest, who's going to have the best seat at the table in the kingdom. You're missing the point. Look at this kid. This is what you ought to be striving for. And so Jesus, in every way that he can conceive of, in word, in deed, in supernatural experiences, in illustrations and object lessons, Jesus has taught this lesson to his disciples over and over and over and over. And they still don't get it. And so why are you and I talking about it this morning is what I want to close with. And this is some straightforward honesty for you this morning, okay? If this can happen, by the way, before you start feeling prematurely guilty, if this can happen to the disciples, should we be surprised at all that it can happen to us? Probably not. Jesus chose these 12 men above everyone else, the hundreds, the thousands who followed him. Jesus chose them, and this was a problem for them. So if it can happen to them, then it can probably happen to us. And we don't need to think when we look at these disciples, well, I wish they were as spiritually minded as I am. This would have never happened. It's probably arrogant, and that's probably not true. So let's consider a few things. The first thing I want you to consider is this question. Are you even being discipled? The reason why the disciples get to have these recurring conversations with their master is because they've got a master that they follow. And I'm here to tell you, as I look around the religious landscape, there's a whole lot of religious people who don't want anybody telling them what to do. They got it. Religion's personal to them. Don't get into their business. Don't correct them. Don't try to guide them. Don't try to teach them. Don't try to ever rebuke them. Whew. They'll go somewhere else if you do that. Are you even being discipled by anybody? Is there anybody in your life who can speak truth, who can set you down and put a child in your midst and teach you something, or do all of those people get pushed out? Are you being discipled? If nobody in your life is in this position, then you're not living the kind of life that Jesus modeled and instructed his followers to live. Because here's the truth of the matter, and you can see it. We just looked at it. If the disciples had been left to their own group, would they have continued in this ignorance indefinitely? Yeah, they disagree about who should be the greatest, but they all agree that somebody should. You with me? They would have never gotten through this. If you had said, listen, Jesus, you've taught us a lot, but we're good. We don't need you anymore. Let us just figure all this stuff out on our own. Let us be just a group on our own, and we don't really need any more leadership. Well, they'd have been in trouble. And this is exactly what happens sometimes when you get a person or a group in the church who decides, we don't need any more help. We're good. We'll figure it all out. The Bible is very specific about the fact that we need to be discipled. We need to be mentored, and we need to have people that we are mentoring. And so when you look at your life and you look at Christianity in your life, which is why I asked you, what's the purpose? Let me give you a hint. If the purpose is all about what you're doing and what you're getting out of it and your position and your place in the church, you're missing the point. Do you have anyone under you that you are helping to bring up in the faith? Is there anyone more spiritually mature than you who's helping you? If those two things are not in place, then I would suggest that you don't understand discipleship at all. If you've just decided, no, we got this group, we're all here, we all agree that God is real, we all love the Bible, we're all trying to get to heaven, we got this. No, you don't. The disciples didn't. There were key, crucial things that they did not yet understand that they needed help with, and everybody is in that position. So are you being discipled? And are you discipling anyone else? This is what Christianity is really all about. Go and make disciples. If you're going to make a disciple, what do you have to do first? You got to be one. I'm never going to make a disciple, which is my commission, if I'm not one myself. If I've already got it all figured out. So are you being discipled? Here's another question. Are you paying attention? I see a lot of this. There's times when the preachers will get together and we'll reflect on what we've been preaching and teaching. And some of us may have had conversations or we've seen things on social media. And here's what we see a lot of the time. We hear things and we see things that give the distinct impression that nobody's been listening. And we'll sit around and we'll think, didn't we just preach about that? Didn't I just do an entire series of classes on that? How in the world is it that this person or this group of people is still acting like this? Are you paying attention? Am I? And the disciples would certainly say, oh yeah, we're paying attention. But which part are you paying attention to? You know, there's people, you're probably one of them and so am I. We're listening for certain things. And when we hear the things we're listening for, it reinforces what we already think and we feel good. And the things we're not listening for, we usually miss. Or we usually chalk them up to not important. Or, well, I wish we'd preach more on this, that, or the other. That's really what I'd like to hear. The disciples were the exact same way. Can we hear more about the coming of the kingdom and power? That part sounded really good. I like that. Let's have a whole series on that. Well, the problem with that is I've got a lot of other things I want you to learn. That's why Paul said I didn't hesitate to preach to you the whole counsel of God, not just your favorite parts. So are you paying attention? And if so, are you paying attention to all of it? What is your focus? Think about this right now, today and this morning. What are you focused on in terms of your Christianity? There is a focus in your life. Absolutely there is. What is it? Let me give you a hint. Is it about you? Or is it about what God has asked you to do? Because one of Satan's greatest tricks is getting you to think for the entirety of your Christianity, hey, focus on yourself. Make sure that you got the right place. Make sure that you are doing this, that, and the other. And don't worry about everybody else around you. It's become a habit among a lot of Christians. And you can see it all around you. You can see people who come into a church, and I don't think this happens here much, but you can see people who come in and visit a church and nobody talks to them. Because their Christianity really has nothing to do with helping this person that nobody knows. Well, that makes me uncomfortable. Or whatever. You can see it when people are more interested in being in their group and talking about the stuff that they want to debate about and they want to discuss. They're much more interested in doing that than they are in doing the thing that Jesus actually instructed all of us to actually do. It's not the same thing. And so, what is your focus? And if you went hunting for selfishness in your life this morning in your approach to Christianity, what would you find? The disciples came up empty, over and over and over again in the Gospels because they didn't actually do it. They never actually self-reflected and said, Jesus is making some points here over and over and over again. Maybe we should think about it. They didn't do that. So they missed it. So if you did that, if you went hunting for selfishness in your approach to Christianity, what would you find and what would you need to do about it? Do you need to be humbled? Do you need to be humbled? As an individual, as a friend group, as a college group, as a church? The disciples did. And if we're thinking, no, that's not me, I'm pretty humble. Trust me when I tell you, you can be humbled more and probably should be. So don't say no to that one. How many times, this is our last point, how many times have you or a group that you're a part of been called together, sat down, and had something explained to you about your mindset, your behavior, your attitude, and the Bible was the standard? How many times has that conversation happened, and how many of those are you going to have before you take it seriously? For example, how many times are we going to have to talk about pornography before you stop watching it? How many lessons are we going to have to talk about gossip before you stop doing it? How many times are we going to have lessons on modesty or premarital sex or any of these issues that are prevalent before somebody says, you know what, you're making a good point, it's in the Bible, I need to change? How many? Because God is long-suffering. Thank God that He's long-suffering. And He doesn't want anybody to perish. But there will come a day when you've had the last conversation about that thing that you need to change that you're ever going to have. What were you discussing on the way? What is it in your life that you are not seeing? What is it about your approach to Jesus that you have not yet realized needs to be changed? I hope that this is something for you to think about. It is for me. Everyone has blind spots, and everyone needs to work on certain areas in their life. And I don't know what it is for you. But I want to encourage you to figure that out. And I want to encourage you to fight through that, to study through that, and to humble yourself and make the changes that need to be made. We love you guys. We're here for you if you need any help. Appreciate you being here this morning.